Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 27. Cora expatiates. Heir presumptive. How the phrase rang in my ears last night when I lay down to sleep after another long, dull evening, for the most part alone with Lady Selina, Lady Penrith having retired soon after we left the dining-room, leaving the spinster and me to amuse each other. The spinster is a late bird, and complains of the dull evenings here, and talks of the superior attractions of other houses owned by other nieces, the large house parties with a constant succession of guests, the theatricals, the charades, the dumb crambo, and music, and cards. Yes, this dissipated old person actually sighs for a riotous game at roulette. Heir presumptive. Of the two lives, my uncle's, so far as I can judge, is the better. His 2 years of seniority count for nothing against my father's habits, late hours, and, I fear, deep drinking. Yet an accident might alter the situation in a breath, an accident, and my father might be the Earl of Penrith and master of this house. Master here, where he has been treated with contumely, sole owner of the house whose door has been shut against him for the last 10 years. Life hangs by so thin a thread. No, I won't suffer my thoughts to dwell upon such possibilities. I'm not particularly fond of my uncle, and I owe him nothing, since anything I enjoy in this house is given to me by his wife. But I won't indulge in castle building upon such a ghastly foundation. Notwithstanding which resolve, I could not resist the temptation of drawing Lady Selina on the subject of the Penrith property when she and I were left alone, and I had to perform my nightly task of sorting her worsteds and admiring her hideous blanket. She is one of the people who I think that high art begins and ends with muddy greens and dingy yellows, when, if they had eyes to see, they would know that the leading note of high art is brilliant colour. I have been rambling about his lordship's estate, said I. What pretty old homesteads and farm buildings, and all so neat and substantial. These homesteads and barns are monuments of my niece's folly. She has squandered her money upon Penrith's property, and her own flesh and blood will never be 1 penny richer for all she has spent. What a pity she has no son to inherit the estate. Ah, that would have made all the difference, sighed Lady Selina. Here is my niece, Lady Hilborough, with an enormous family, and my sister, Lady Ranthorpe, with 3 great hulking boys at Eton and Cooper's Hill, and 2 more in the nursery, and here is poor Sybil, childless. That is her misfortune, poor girl, but it does not excuse her folly in lavishing tens of thousands upon her husband's estate. Why should she not spend her money on improvements? She might spend it upon Ellerslie, which she can leave to her own family. Ellerslie is perfection. There is very little room for spending money. She could buy more land. There is always land to be bought nowadays, and ridiculously cheap. She ought to have quadrupled her own stake rather than sunk a fortune upon her husband's property. Penrith was almost a pauper when he married, but she has paid off every mortgage, and doubled the value of his farms by her improvements. No doubt it has amused her to improve. I can fancy nothing more delightful than messing about a large estate, picking old buildings to pieces and putting them together again, seeing order and beauty, where all was squalor and ugliness. All very well, if there had been an heir, but in the existing state of things, sheer lunacy, said Lady Selina decisively. And if Penrith were to die, my father, whom Lady Penrith detests, would be enriched by the wealth she has lavished. He would spring at once from poverty to riches, and his riches would be derived from her, an unencumbered estate, land in the perfection of high farming, tenants who know they are better off than any other tenants in Cumberland. He would owe all to her, and could turn her out of doors if he liked, as Penrith turned him out 2 days ago. Well, I won't dwell upon the thought. This journal of mine is not a starched composition, but it shall not be ghastly, and I won't let my mind brood upon the chances that hang by the fine-spun thread of one life. But if I dismiss one hideous subject, shake off the gloom of one idea, other fancies crowd in upon me as dark or darker. I cannot get the thought of that murdered girl out of my mind. Curious as I have been about that tragic story, I had resolved not to ask any questions of the servants, but I have broken down in that commendable resolution. A lady never talks to servants except in a purely businesslike manner. Put out my blue gown. Put away my red. Where are my satin shoes? And so on. Nothing more interesting than an Ollendorff dialogue should ever pass between mistress and maid. Well, I am as much a lady as I can be, but I am first a woman, and I am devoured by a morbid curiosity that must be satisfied. The horror of that murder haunts me. A young woman, young and beautiful, full of the pride of life, caught like a hunted fawn in a wood, caught and slaughtered by a raging maniac, for the epilepsy that hungers for blood must be lunacy under its most revolting aspect. No one saw her struggles. If she had time to cry for help, no ear heard her cry. In the loneliness and darkness, the murderer's knife did its trick. I know all about it now. The picture presented by Lady Selina was vague and shadowy, but last night I let her ladyship's maid come into my room after her mistress had gone to bed, and while she was brushing my hair, I led up to the story of Marie Arnold's death. The woman has all the ghoulish relish for horrors, which seems natural to persons in that sphere, and she was charmed to dilate upon every detail. She took immense credit to herself for having been at Ellerslie at the time. One of her male relatives could have been no more proud had he ridden along that avenue of guns we all know so well in the Balaclava charge. She was at Ellerslie. She followed in the murdered girl's funeral procession. She never hopes to see such a funeral again. She distinctly used the word hope. She was really very interesting. She conjured up the image of a young woman in all her showy foreign beauty. She suggested the unrevealed link between her and Sir Joseph, Everybody in the steward's room had suspected that she was something nearer and dearer than an adopted daughter, though she had been put somewhat in the background, and when they saw the poor old gentleman's grief after her death, they were sure they had guessed right. And then she described Braddon Mountford as a man from whom no evil could have been anticipated, so handsome, such a gentleman, always polite to the servants, though he kept to himself very much, and he had no valet, and on the morning before the murder he had been in his own room packing for some hours. The servants noticed a change in him at luncheon that day. He was in the garden with Miss Higginson after luncheon, and later in the afternoon my informant saw him going into his own room again, and he looked pale and agitated. Very much upset was her expression. She was sitting at her needlework by a window in the corridor, and she could hear him walking up and down his room and throwing things about, and when she looked into the room after he had gone downstairs, she found his portmanteau still open and his books and things scattered about, as if he had been too upset to get on with his packing. He was seen by one of the men going out into the garden again, but at dinner there was no sign of him, nor of Miss Arnold. And then she told me how Miss Arnold had also seemed very much upset at luncheon, and had left the room before the meal was finished, and she told me that there was no doubt in her mind that poor Miss Arnold was deeply in love with Mr. Mountford. "And he with her?" I asked. "Oh, no, miss," says the woman. "It was a regular game of cross purposes. Mr. Mountford was in love with my young mistress. One could see that with half an eye, but there was someone else in love with Miss Arnold, and had been for a long time." "Who was that?" asked I. "You might be offended, miss, if I was to say." Her meaning flashed upon me in a moment. "You mean my father?" "Yes, miss. Mr. Urquhart was very much attached to Miss Arnold. He wanted to marry her, but she wouldn't have him. One of the gardeners overheard their talk in the conservatory one afternoon. He was at work behind the tree ferns, and they didn't know he was there, and they talked quite free, and the young man didn't like to show himself after they began to talk, so he stopped quietly there till after they left the conservatory. Mr. Urquhart was quite violent, carried away by his feelings, the young man said, but Miss Arnold was very haughty and determined. She couldn't have been prouder had she been a duchess." This revelation throws a new light upon my father's character. I did not think passionate love was in his line, even when he was 10 years younger, and that he could be in love with the poor dependent while the millionaire heiress was in the house to be wooed and won. That was strange. And then, when this poor girl was dead, he had set himself to win the heiress, and had failed dismally. I asked Ferriby if she and her fellow servants believed in Mr. Mountford's guilt. "I'm afraid there's no doubt about it, miss," she answered, shaking her head. "He was the nicest of gentlemen, but he was not a bit like himself that day. Several of us saw the change in him, and he must have killed her in a fit of madness. They say his poor mother was mad for many years, and died in a madhouse. If he wasn't guilty, why would he run away? Yes, that flight of his was the strongest evidence against him." "Was no one ever else suspected?" I asked. "No one, miss. Not by any one of us. But Sir Joseph, he would never believe that Mr. Mountford was the murderer. He told the steward so. He believed that the poor young lady was killed by a tramp for the sake of the jewellery she was wearing." "Was her jewellery taken?" "No, miss, not a thing. But then Sir Joseph said the murderer must have been surprised by Mr. Mountford's approach before he had time to rob his victim, and had slipped off through the wood without being seen by the 2 stablemen who were searching for the poor young lady. That was Sir Joseph's idea, but we didn't see it. If Mr. Mountford was innocent, he'd no call to run away, even if those who were interested in him over-persuaded him." "You mean your mistress," said I. The woman nodded significantly. "Yes, miss. My mistress and Mr. Urquhart were both mixed up in it. They acted for the best, no doubt, but if the poor gentleman was innocent, they made him look guilty." They made him look guilty. I have thought of those words a good deal since her ladyship's maid uttered them. May not one of those concerned in the wretched man's flight have meant to damage him rather than to aid? There can be no doubt of Miss Higginson's good faith, but my father's motive is not so obvious. I'm afraid I am as much of a ghoul as Ferriby, for ever since that young woman brushed my hair last night, I have been haunted by the image of the young, amiable, handsome man tormented by one of the direst diseases that afflict humanity, a disease which can change the man who would not hurt a worm into a bloodthirsty murderer. So haunted have I been all day by the ghastly suggestion of a kindly and courteous gentleman suddenly transformed into a human wild beast, that I have been absolutely unable to stay quietly indoors, least of all to endure solitary confinement with Lady Selina, which I should have to endure if I had not taken the key of the fields. Lady Penrith retired to her own room after breakfast with the meagre excuse of having letters to write. I believe she really does cover reams of notepaper in the course of her correspondence with innumerable aunts and cousins, among the latter of whom there is always one who is just engaged or just going to be married, and who requires extra sympathy and something magnificent in the way of a wedding present. But I doubt if aunts or cousins are profiting much by her ladyship's present seclusion, as I shrewdly suspect that her only correspondent is Mr. Coverdale, and that he sits in her morning room waiting for wires from that clerical knight-errant. I left the castle soon after her disappearance, and in my purposeless wanderings on the moor, whom should I meet but Mr. Dewsnap, the family doctor, the dapper bachelor who attends her ladyship and my uncle for any small ailment, and who generally has a patient or two among the castle household. He has been allowed to look at my tongue and feel my pulse on 1 or 2 occasions, and has been disappointed to discover me a wiry little person, never good for more than 3 visits. He was riding an elderly white pony, but at the sight of my trim tailor gown and toque, jumped off and put the bridle over his arm. He looks about 40, an elderly young man, very neat in his dress, with, I fancy, some pretension to lady-killing. And above all, he is an inveterate gossip. He seemed delighted at the opportunity of talking to me. For Mr. Coverdale, I may be only a plain young woman, but for the family practitioner, I am the young lady of Killander Castle, an earl's niece, and worthy of attention. Under ordinary circumstances, I should certainly have kept him very much in his place, and he would have remounted his ancient steed in 5 minutes. But in my present mood I was delighted to get a talk with a man who could tell me all about that horrible malady which I had been brooding upon in connection with Braddon Mountford. We talked of the weather, and then I said casually, "No doubt you are able to read all the local meteorological signs, for I am told you've lived in this neighbourhood for a good many years." "Except when I was walking the hospital in London, I have hardly ever lived anywhere else," answered he. "My father had the only good practice between here and Workington. I began my professional career as his assistant, and I have continued as his successor. I doubt if I shall ever extend my travels beyond these hills and moors. A country practice gives a vast variety of experience." "No doubt. You must have seen many curious cases in all these years," said I, walking slowly along the footpath while the medico sauntered at my side, and the medico's horse crept along, cropping the russet sward as he went. "I wonder if you remember that terrible event at Ellerslie Park 10 years ago?" "If you mean the murder of Marie Arnold, it would not be easy for me to forget it," replied the doctor. "I was acquainted with that unfortunate young lady. She was the most beautiful woman I ever saw." "Was she handsomer than my aunt, Lady Penrith?" "Oh, quite another style of beauty. A more brilliant style, distinctly southern, a richer colouring. I own to a weakness for rich colouring." He looked at my drab complexion, hesitated, and added, "Though where there is an intellectual expression, where mind lights the face, colouring is of secondary importance." Ugh, with what weariness of spirit I have heard that specious lie about my intellectual expression, heard it from the lips of men whom shone in every look that I was of no more account in their sight than if my face had been cut out of wood. "I see you greatly admired that poor girl," said I. Mr. Dewsnap's only answer was a profound sigh. "Can you believe that Mr. Mountford was her murderer?" I asked. "My dear Miss Urquhart," cried the creature, growing disgustingly familiar, "I can believe anything of an epileptic subject, just as I can believe anything of a madman. From the moment I knew Mountford was epileptic, and heard of his low spirits and discomposure on the day of the murder, I had little doubt of his guilt. That gloomy agitation presaged an attack, and there is no doubt that alone in the wood the devil of epilepsy seized upon him, and as the fit passed it left him like the demoniac of old, panting with fierce impulses, thirsting for blood. And with that savage rage upon him, he met that poor girl, seized her as the tiger seizes its prey, and killed her more swiftly than the tiger kills. I have thought it all out. The image of the victim has haunted me." He stifled a sob, and I began to feel more kindly towards him. "Yes," he continued after a pause, "the man who I had only seen as a calm, well-mannered gentleman was the fiend who killed Marie Arnold. The same, but not the same. And when the deed was done, he fell down beside his victim, exhausted, in a comatose sleep, and on awakening from which memory was a blank. He might remember nothing of that savage crime. He might feel nothing but a confused sense of trouble." "Have you heard what became of him after his escape from the lock-up?" I asked. "No one in this neighbourhood has any actual knowledge of his fate. He may have landed somewhere along the coast, within a few miles of Ardliston, before the fishing boat in which he left came to grief. But the general idea is that he went down with the skipper and his crew. Nothing has ever been heard of him since that night by anyone around here." "Then it would likely seem that he was drowned. Or might he not have left the country and gone back to Africa, for instance?" "Yes, that would be probable enough, if they were able to land him before the worst of the storm." We had come to the junction between the footpath and the Ardliston road, and here the doctor bade me good day, remounted his pony, and trotted homewards, while I turned my face toward the castle, where I arrived only a few minutes before luncheon. I was surprised to see the station brougham waiting at the door with a portmanteau, a small black trunk, and a travelling bag on the roof. "Who is going away?" I asked the groom, though the S.P. painted in bold red letters upon the portmanteau left no room for doubt. "Her ladyship is leaving by the 2:40 train, ma'am." "For London?" The groom did not know. I ran into the house and to the dining-room, where I found Lady Selina and her niece, the elder lady evidently out of temper, and the younger grave and composed, but very pale, and with that eager look in her eyes which has distinguished her of late. "What wonders are happening!" I exclaimed. "To think of you deserting us like this, aunt! Are you going to London?" "No, not nearly so far." "Where, then, if one might venture to ask?" "One may ask anything, Cora, but my movements are so uncertain that it is hardly worth entering into particulars. I hope to be home again in a day or two. If there should be any need to write to me, my aunt has an address that will find me." "What shall we do without you?" "I daresay you will contrive to exist." A servant appeared at the dining-room door. "Are my things in the carriage? Is Ferriby there?" "Yes, my lady. Kingdon says it is time for you to start." Kingdon is her ladyship's particular coachman. His office is to drive her, and no one else, and to be waited upon and worked for by 3 or 4 underlings. "You had better let me go with you, Sibyl," said Lady Selina, as if following up a previous request. "Impossible. Take care of yourself, auntie, and of Cora." "How shall I explain your absence to Penrith?" "I have explained in a letter. Goodbye." She kissed her aunt, gave me a friendly nod, and hurried away. We both followed to the hall and stood disconsolately watching as the brougham drove away, with Lady Penrith inside, and Lady Penrith's confidential maid with her. Most women in her position would have a highly trained Parisian, with fairy fingers for the adjustment of ribbons or lace, and with fine taste in hairdressing. Lady Penrith has kept the woman who came to her from a village school, and has been in her service for over 10 years. If one were inclined to think evil, one might suspect her ladyship of some secret reason for keeping this woman about her. Old servants are not to be lightly dismissed. They know too much. But I must add that Ferriby spoke of her mistress with a frankness and freedom which one would not expect if there were any secrets in Lady Penrith's life. Lady Selina ate her luncheon in silence, evidently out of temper with her niece and in things in general. She sent away some roast pheasant because it was too high. She objected to the fricasseed fowl because the mushrooms in the sauce were underdone. "I think Lady Penrith has about as bad a chef as money could buy for her," said Lady Selina, "and I have observed that the higher wages people give, the worse cooks they get. We had a cordon bleu at Basingstoke House for £40 a year. My father couldn't afford a man cook, but we had better dinners than people who are giving £300 a year to a chef. Better everyday food, I mean, my dear." And then the spinster thawed and read me a long lecture about the management of a great house, which I fear can never be of the slightest use to me. A shabby London lodging or a tiny villa in a dusty suburb is the only hope I can see waiting for me in the dismal desert of my future. Lady Selina ate an enormous luncheon in spite of her abuse of the cook, and talked for nearly an hour about the folly of masters and mistresses and the iniquity of servants, of her nieces who managed well and her nieces who managed ill, till I found myself upon the point of dropping asleep. I proposed a drive before tea. Lady Selina has scarcely finished her lunch when she begins to look forward to her tea. No, she didn't care about driving. There were only 2 tolerable drives, and she knew them both by heart. She would sit by the fire and get on with her work. So by the fire I left her, promising to go back to her at tea time, and went to the billiard room. My father had gone out shooting by himself directly after breakfast, and was not likely to return until dusk. So I had the room and the table to myself, and I gave myself an hour's practice, making the most brilliant flukes and some really clever cannons, and accomplishing the spot stroke 6 or 7 times in succession. It is wonderful how good a game I can play when I have no opponent and no gallery. An hour of this work tired me, so I put on my hat and set out on another ramble. My mind has been so thoroughly unhinged of late that nothing but a long walk seems to do me any good, a long, lonely walk in a wild, bleak landscape. No doubt Lady Penrith has gone to Keswick. The 2:40 train stops at Keswick. I looked at Bradshaw in the hall on my way to the billiard room. She has gone to join Coverdale. There is something mysterious going on in which he is her agent and preux chevalier. Were she a different woman, were he another man, I might suspect a guilty intrigue. But if I could suspect her of evil, I could not believe evil of him. If ever there were truth and candour to be found in mankind, they are to be found in John Coverdale. He is a King Arthur among priests. Ah, if I had but been handsome! Oh, if he had but cared for me, how I could have cast off this slough of wickedness which has gradually grown over me and over my mind and my heart, and I would have emerged from the dismal swamp of past experience a good woman, purified by his love, ennobled by sympathy with his noble nature. I cannot imagine evil where he is concerned, so I can only think that secret business which enrages Lady Penrith and her friend has some relation to her past life, to the romance of her girlhood, to the tragic story of Braddon Mountford. My idea is that the man has come back from Africa, and that Lady Penrith and Mr. Coverdale are engaged in finding him some safe retreat, some secluded spot where he might be out of the reach of the law. The afternoon has been dull and bitingly cold, and I am sitting as close as I can to the cosy fire in my comfortable room, half dressing room, half boudoir, whose thick walls keep out wind and weather, a very comfortable room. Indeed, there are no comforts or luxuries lacking in my life at Callander Castle, and if it were not for the uncertain tenure by which I hold these things, the dependence upon her ladyship's liking, I might be happy. Happy, quotha, with such a father at my door. Happy with the gnawing knowledge that my plain face cuts me off from the golden chances that lie all along the pathway of a pretty woman's life, like the enchanted apples that distracted Atalanta. When I came in at 5:30, I found to my great relief that Lady Selina had a headache and was lying down, so I came straight to my own snug room, threw some logs on the fire, and had my tea tray, with a pile of those delicious little pastry cakes which the still-room maid makes to perfection, brought to me here, and here I am at 7:15, still scribbling the record of the day, for my own amusement only. I find an undiminishing interest in this volume. The facility with which my pen runs along the page makes me think that I shall some day blossom into a novelist. I see myself, 10 years hence, a spinster novelist, in a snug little house in Mayfair. The merest doll's house would do, provided it were in a smart street. That would not be half so bad. My father might be dead by that time. I'm not calculating on its death in a cold-blooded manner, but we are all mortal, and it is only natural that I should look forward to the years when I may stand alone in the world, free from a tie that galls me, but perhaps without a friend. I must be a fool if I quarrel with the one friend who has made life pleasant for me, a fool if I let envy and all uncharitableness set me against Sybil Penrith. Yet, when I see her absorbing John Coverdale's attentions, see her spoiling what might have been my chance of winning his affection, it is very difficult for me not to hate her. To see her so handsome, so richly provided with all the good things of this world, so scornful of the wealth for which most of us are ready to sell our souls to Satan. I can't help remembering that she has done nothing to deserve this good fortune except take the trouble to be born, as somebody said, of a French patrician. Well, at any rate, let me think twice before I do anything to forfeit her friendship. I won't be in any hurry to tell my father of this sudden journey of hers. It is clear to me now that he means mischief. I am worried and perplexed by his hanging about this neighbourhood, living almost in hiding at the inn at Ardliston, and I shall feel it a profound relief when he is gone. Why should he linger here? He can hardly mean to make a further appeal to my uncle, to be again insulted and repulsed. What a hard-hearted wretch Penrith must be. Granted that my father behaved badly in his courtship of the heiress, what superior merit can the Earl boast of on his own part? He, too, wanted the fortune, much more than the lady, and I dare say would have stooped to any meanness to win her. I saw my father this afternoon. Saw him amusing himself in a solitary way, just like his brother, who I believe is happier now the house party has gradually melted away, and he can prowl over the hills alone with his gun and dogs, than when he had his friends about him, and when the great stone hall used to echo their talk and laughter as they set out in the morning. I was walking along the topmost ridge of the hill in the keen frosty air when I caught sight of my father in the valley below, crossing a stubble field with his gun under his arm, a gun but no dog. Could he be poaching? I wondered. I knew so little of the game laws that I don't know whether it would be poaching on his part to shoot any bird that he chanced upon in those fields, but as I believe all the land around here belongs to my uncle, and as they are ill friends, I concluded that the Honourable Hubert Urquhart, heir presumptive to the title and estates, can be no better than a common poacher when he knocks down a pheasant on his brother's land. Heir presumptive, quotha. In the reading of the description of some sprig of nobility's marriage the other day, I read that as heir presumptive to the Duke of Dash, he had been handsomely provided for by that nobleman. As heir presumptive, all that my father has received as heir presumptive is what Lady Penrith's nephew would call the dirty kick-out. Hideous slang, no doubt, but it best expresses the treatment that my brother, as younger brother, received from the elder, as heir presumptive. The sky was darkening, and the hard ground was hardening under the frosty wind. I saw my father creeping along by the low stone wall, with his gun, stopping to look about him every now and then, intent on pheasants, no doubt. There was nothing left of the sun but a low yellow light behind the dark shoulder of the moor, and eastward the shadows of evening were stealing over the leaden-coloured sea, but there was light enough for me to watch my father's movements. He was queerly dressed, and looked like a keeper or even a keeper's underling. It amused me to watch his movements with a touch of contempt for the sporting instinct which could gratify itself at the sacrifice of self-respect. To steal the birds upon the land of a man who had heaped insult upon him, and that man his brother. He passed through a gap in the stone wall into a second field, a field I knew well, for it skirts the footpath by which the shooters often come down the hill on their way home, and along which I have tramped with him many a time. How merry we have been sometimes along that path! What trifles have set us in a roar! That little snub is an amusing little beast, but I'm afraid I need to laugh at his jokes with a frankness that disgusted the Reverend John, if he happened to be with us. Not that there was anything really wrong in the jokes, only a touch of vulgarity, a flavour of the mess-room and the stables. But men like John Coverdale are so easily scared, and then there is all the difference between a pretty woman and a plain one. From beauty's lips, even the slang of the saddle room has charm. Human nature has such strange sports and varieties. There are men, starched prigs like John Coverdale, who are fascinated by their opposites, and who make themselves the world's wonder by choosing a wife out of the gutter. But such men are poor invertebrate creatures, in spite of the starch. Their prim propriety is only outside wear. Not so with John Coverdale. With him it is the whiteness of a lofty spirit. He is firm as a rock, knows his ideal, and will accept nothing less than perfect and pure. And he has found his ideal in Lady Penrith, whom he can't marry, but whom he can worship. The thought of those homeward walks in the twilight with him, in those hours when he condescended to talk with me as a friend and intellectual equal, and when I felt myself another creature, the very thought of that past, so recent yet so far away, made me melancholy. I am not prone to the melting mood, but there were tears in my eyes as I watched my father stealing along the stone wall toward the high tangled hedge which divides the field from the footpath. One of the few real rustic English hedges around here, where the fields are so large and for the most part bounded by ugly stone walls. What a stealthy air a solitary sportsman has! How much more like a poacher my father looked, creeping along under the shadow of the hedge, waiting for his chance. No dog to point or put up his bird for him, only the chance of some belated pheasant lumbering heavily home to its cover, or rising scared at the sound of those stealthy footsteps. It seemed very poor sport to my mind, but I can imagine that my father may feel a malicious pleasure in shooting a brace or two of Penrith's pampered birds, which are said to cost him half a guinea apiece, almost within earshot of the castle. He was not very lucky while I watched him, for he only fired once, just as I was turning my footsteps homeward across the open moor. Only one shot. How it echoed along the silent valley, with a sharp, rattling sound, which set a regiment of rooks screaming and chattering high above my head in the grey evening gloom. The cold grew sharper with the sinking of the sun, so I hurried home as fast as I could to my snug room and the rousing fire and the plenteous tea-table. Assuredly, in choosing between my father and Lady Penrith, I should be a fool if I were to hesitate as to where my loyalty should be given. 8 o'clock, and I am only half dressed. No matter, for there will be nobody sitting down to dinner in the castle tonight. I was in the midst of my dressing-room when I was startled by a tremendous ringing of bells and opening and shutting of doors below. Could Lady Penrith have returned unexpectedly? No, it must be something more than that. The sudden arrival of a whole family could hardly cause such noise of hurrying footsteps and ringing of bells as I heard reverberating through the stone hall and corridors. I flew out to the gallery to listen, wrapped in my dressing-gown, with my hair streaming, and there stood, trying to make out the meaning of these sounds. But they gradually died away into silence, and I was none the wiser. An inexplicable terror was upon me. My hands were shaking. Then, when I knew nothing, my teeth chattering, almost as badly as my hand shakes now as I write this, now that I know the worst. Agonized with that dreadful uncertainty, I went along the gallery to the great open space at the top of the staircase, hearing low murmurs of several voices and the heavy tread of feet upon the stairs as I hurried on. I knew what that tread meant. They were carrying something upstairs. The something was Lord Penrith. 4 men were carrying him slowly, very slowly, up the broad staircase to his bedroom, and he lay in their arms without sound or movement as much as one finger of the hand that swung loosely from the sleeve of his dark grey shooting jacket. I drew back into the shadow and saw that awful group pass by almost in silence, while a servant who had gone in advance opened the door of the bedroom and lighted the lamps inside. They passed in with their burden, and the door was shut. I ran downstairs and found plenty of people standing about, eager to tell me what had happened. He was dead. It was an accident, a common kind of accident, which might have been avoided by the most ordinary precaution on his lordship's part. He had been found, shot to the heart and lungs, lying across a gap in the hedge, his gun by his side, one charge exploded. It was the old story of a sportsman scrambling through the hedge with his loaded gun in his hand. His lordship had dismissed the keeper late in the afternoon and had walked home alone. The keeper thought he would have gone the shortest way by the footpath, but instead of that he must have taken a somewhat wider round and skirted the big turnip field to get into the footpath by the gap at the lower end, a gap which the shooters had used very often that season. They were all eager to give me the details. His favourite Clumber spaniel had been with us and had come back to the castle in a cowed and frightened condition, which had given the first alarm at the kennels, the men seeing that something was wrong with the dog, and apprehending an accident to his master. And then the stablemen started in a body to search the homeward track, and they found their master in a hedge at the bottom of the hill. A stone wall divides the turnip field from its neighbours on 3 sides. There is only the hedge by the footpath, almost the only hedge upon his lordship's estate, moaned the house steward. Why do I place these things on record? God knows. My hand shakes so that it is difficult to write. My fire is nearly out. I sit shivering beside smouldering logs, and my room, which looked so bright and cheery an hour ago, is now the picture of desolation. The northeast wind is shrieking outside my window. I shall write no more in this journal. I close the book forever this miserable night. My heart is frozen. End of chapter 27.